Hi, everyone. My name's Morgan. I study applied AI at MIT, and I'm also in training to become a clinical psychiatrist. So today I'd like to tell you a little bit about applications of AI in mental health. But before we do that, let's talk about mental health in general. You might have heard before that we're in the midst of a mental health crisis globally. This was the case even before the COVID-19 pandemic, but has only accelerated since then as more and more people are suffering from mental disorders as a result of the pandemic. To put some numbers on it, hundreds of millions of people worldwide suffer from mental illness. Here in Latin America, 15% of all people will have some sort of mental disorder in any given year. It's almost certainly the case that for everybody in this room, there's somebody that you know or care about who's suffering from some kind of mental disorder. It might be depression or anxiety or alcohol use disorder. They might not understand it in those terms. They might think of it as, por ejemplo, susto or nervios. Despite the large number of people who suffer from mental disorders globally and here in Latin America, 75% of people in Latin America who need mental health treatment don't receive it. For example, here in Guatemala, the entire mental health care system consists almost entirely of a single inpatient psychiatric hospital. Now, what do I mean by mental health care and mental health treatment? It's been the case for a while now that we do have effective treatments for mental disorders that work for most patients and allow people to get much better. We have medications that are effective for many disorders. We have psychotherapy, which ranges from supportive talk therapy all the way to more structured, evidence-based psychotherapeutic frameworks. For example, cognitive behavioral therapy is effective for many disorders. In this framework, patients learn a variety of skills that allow them to gradually alter the ways they think and behave in ways that allow them to slowly overcome the symptoms of the disorder they suffer from. For more severe cases, we have inpatient hospitalization, and we also have emerging technologies like brain stimulation and even psychedelic therapies. But these treatments are only effective for people who can access them. This is personal to me because I've seen many people in my life who I know and care about suffer greatly from mental disorders. As a trainee in an inpatient psychiatric hospital, I've seen mental illness that is untreated destroy people's lives and their families. But I've also seen people rebuild their lives and get so much better when they have access to the treatment that they need. To me, this is the tragedy of mental health care today. So many people are suffering, but 75% of them are not receiving the help that they need. This is preventable suffering. But this also presents an opportunity because we have a lever to make such a positive difference in society by simply enabling greater access to the treatments that are already available. So let's break this down. What are the barriers to accessing mental health care? An obvious one is cost. Not everybody can afford to see a therapist or receive mental health treatment, and not everybody has health insurance, and not every health insurance plan covers mental health treatments. There's also the issue of the lack of providers. There are not nearly enough mental health practitioners for the number of patients that need assistance from them. These practitioners are not evenly distributed. There's a concentration of mental health practitioners in urban areas, while people in rural areas disproportionately lack access to mental health care, creating an urban-rural divide in mental health. There's still shame and stigma in society about the idea of mental illness. People might be reluctant to admit to others or even to themselves that they suffer from a mental disorder, a prerequisite step before they can seek help. Parents who have a child who's suffering might be reluctant to raise this with the child's teachers or even their doctors for fear that putting a label on the child will place them at a disadvantage. This creates yet another barrier to accessing care that can make a real difference in people's lives. And finally, for people who understand that they need help and want to seek it, it's not always clear how to get started. How do you find the right therapist? What kind of treatment do you need? What exactly is it that you're suffering from? These are difficult questions, and it presents another barrier. I'd like to argue today that for each of these barriers, artificial intelligence can play a direct or indirect role in addressing them. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity here for artificial intelligence technologies to make a difference for mental health treatment, but also for access to mental health treatment. Before we talk about AI in earnest, let's talk about digital tools more broadly, smartphone applications and the like. These are already making a big difference, and I think there's potential for more improvements in the future. For example, telemedicine applications enable mental health care to reach more patients, especially in rural areas. A person in a rural area can see a provider who practices in an urban area using telemedicine. There are lots of studies showing that patients who might be unwilling to or unable to seek care in the traditional mental health care systems are willing and able to use some sort of smartphone application for their mental health. This could be anything from a meditation app to a sleep tracking app to an app that allows tracking mood or other symptoms over time. These can have incremental benefits, but they can also serve as a stepping stone, a kind of foot in the door effect, where once somebody engages with addressing their mental health, they're more likely to engage with traditional mental health care systems and get even more effective treatment. And finally, I talked about these evidence-based psychotherapy frameworks like cognitive behavioral therapy. There's been a number of studies in recent years showing that delivering these forms of therapy by smartphone applications with minimal human intervention can be just as effective in many cases as treatment delivered in person by a therapist. You can imagine how this could alleviate the problem of the lack of providers and also reduce costs and potentially make it more likely for these treatments to be covered by insurance. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, large language models. You might imagine that these models could supercharge all of the applications that I just talked about, and I think to some extent that's true. There's even talk of the ChatGPT psychiatrist, the therapist that is being replaced by a large language model. I don't think we're there yet, and I'll talk a little bit about why. But in the meantime, I think there are a lot of opportunities for large language models to make therapists' jobs easier, allow them to see more patients or spend more of their time interacting meaningfully with patients. For example, today, psychiatrists and other mental health care practitioners spend a great deal of time documenting their encounters with patients. This is time that could be spent actually talking to the patient and thinking about their case. I think much of this can be offloaded to large language models. You could also imagine a large language model, a chatbot, conducting an initial interview with the patient, gathering information about their medical and psychiatric history, the experiences they've had recently, and things they'd like to talk about with the provider, saving time and setting the stage for more meaningful interactions when the appointment begins in earnest. You could even imagine a chatbot playing a supporting role in therapy between appointments, perhaps answering questions or remembering things that the patient wants to remember to bring up in their next appointment. As far as replacing a clinician entirely, the ChatGPT therapist, I think we still have a ways to go. One major reason for this is, as you might have heard, these models are black boxes. Nobody really knows what's going on inside these models, and because of this, it's very hard to predict how a model will react in a novel situation. The stakes in the field of healthcare, including mental health, are high when it comes to mistakes and a lack of robustness. Providing a patient with false or misleading information could have real consequences, so this demands great scrutiny before we allow large language models to play more complete roles in this space. So let's say that large language models have a large beneficial impact, on average, on mental health and mental health care. Who do these benefits go to? Large language models today are developed for better or worse. At least the most recent ones are often developed in the United States and in other English-speaking countries. I think that there are many studies showing that these models perform at a certain level when queried in English, but when queried in other languages, say Spanish or Portuguese, they don't perform as well. So as we implement large language models in our healthcare systems, we run the risk of people who don't speak English or from countries other than the US receiving care that is less optimal or less high quality than patients who speak English, exacerbating existing healthcare inequalities. I think the solution to this is local innovation. I think we need people in every part of the world, and that includes Latin America, developing large language model-based solutions in mental health care that are targeted towards specific cultures and specific populations. I think this is what will alleviate those disparities and allow large language models to make a bigger difference worldwide, not just in Western European English-speaking countries. So we've seen that there are many effective treatments already for mental illnesses, and we've seen how large language models could play a role in making these treatments more scalable, especially when it comes to psychotherapy. But there's another big piece of the mental health care equation that we haven't addressed at all, and that's the question of how to assign a treatment to each patient that they will most likely benefit from. Now, this might seem trivial, diagnosis and treatment, but in mental health care, it's a little bit convoluted. The way we do this now is by consulting this magical book, the DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This is a book developed by mental health care experts who sit in committees and use evidence to try to come up with frameworks to put people in boxes like depression or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. I'll give you an example. For somebody to be diagnosed with depression, they need to experience low mood or a lack of interest in activities once enjoyed for a period of 2 weeks or longer, and they need to have 5 or more of 9 specific symptoms, which are things like appetite disruptions, sleep disruptions, lack of energy, and so on. If that sounds arbitrary, it's because it kind of is. Psychiatrists have to draw the line somewhere about how they separate people into boxes, and the reason we do this is to assign treatments to patients. We know that we have some treatments that are effective for depression, and those might be different from the treatments that are effective for, say, schizophrenia. But even within these categories that we've created as a field, it's not always clear which specific treatment for that disorder should be assigned to each patient. For example, there are many different antidepressants that could be given to somebody with depression, and the way people determine the best treatment right now is by trial and error. You give a patient one treatment, and in maybe 3, 4, 5 weeks, it becomes clear that the treatment is working or it isn't. If it isn't, you switch to a different treatment, and then the next one, and the next one. And this whole time, the patient is suffering where they might not need to be if we'd chosen the right treatment for them off the bat. The hope for machine learning in this context is that we can use large data sets with information about what kinds of patients respond to what kinds of treatments to assign treatments to patients in a more principled and data-driven way. So where's this data going to come from? Well, we can collect a lot of data readily from patients' smartphones, everything from social activity like texts and calls to location information, and we can collect even more data from wearable devices about sleep and activity. We can also collect biomedical data like genomics data and even electronic health records. Let's combine all of these rich data for each patient to create a picture of who each patient is. And let's collect a lot of data for a lot of patients with lots of disorders to figure out what kinds of patients respond to what kinds of treatments. We're going to call this approach personalized medicine. And it's a grand vision that is far from new. It's been around for decades in the healthcare space. So let's try to make this more approachable. I'd like to provide an example from my own research. Instead of looking at all disorders, all patients, and all treatments, let's focus on one disorder and one treatment for that disorder. In my research, I did a project on body dysmorphic disorder and a treatment called cognitive behavioral therapy, which I mentioned. Body dysmorphic disorder is a situation where patients are fixated on a perceived flaw in their appearance. It might be their nose, their skin, their hair, or the size of their muscles. And patients spend many hours every day, oftentimes, either looking in the mirror or trying to fix their appearance, maybe by picking at their skin or their hair. This disorder is tragically common. It's about 2 to 3% of the population, and it's also quite severe. 25% of those patients will have attempted suicide at some time in their life. Fortunately, we have an effective treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, but it doesn't work for everybody. I set out to answer the question, who will respond to these therapies, and can we predict who will respond before treatment starts? So a bunch of data was collected from a cohort of patients who were about to be treated for body dysmorphic disorder with this cognitive behavioral therapy. Everything from demographic information like their age, their gender, their ethnicity, to comorbid disorders they might have. Many patients also suffer from depression or anxiety. We also collected a measure called the Credibility and Expectancy Questionnaire, treatment credibility. This is a measure of the extent to which patients believe in the treatment they're about to receive. Do they think it's a logical treatment? Do they think it's going to work for them? And is it the kind of treatment that they'd recommend to a friend who had similar needs to themselves? To cut a long story short, all of our machine learning efforts with this data gave us a very simple but powerful model, a decision tree. This is a model that takes data from the patient and makes a series of binary decisions to decide whether they're likely to respond to the treatment, they're likely to get better, or whether they're likely to not get better. And you can see that the first decision that this model makes, and the most important one for its performance, is the level of that patient's treatment credibility, the extent to which they believe in the treatment that they're about to receive, that it's logical, that it's likely to help them. This might be not as profound as you might hope, maybe even disappointing. It doesn't seem mechanistic, but in some ways it's also exciting because this is something that we could potentially modify for patients. You could imagine introducing additional patient education so that patients understand the therapy they're about to receive more fully, how the therapy works, how it's likely to benefit them. This could actually increase the ultimate effectiveness of the therapy. So simple models like this, a far cry from the advanced large language models and neural network systems that are the subject of much of today's conference, this is so much simpler, but it's also interpretable. And that makes it practical in healthcare because we can get insights like the one I just talked about credibility. Additionally, healthcare providers are more likely to actually use algorithms that they can understand. They're more likely to trust them. Of course, this is a very limited model at the same time. You couldn't imagine this doing something comparable to a chatbot based on a large language model. It just won't work. Even if you could make a decision tree that could do that, it would be so large that it wouldn't be interpretable anyway. So one interesting question, I think, is are there frameworks that allow us to combine powerful inference and powerful AI performance in various domains with interpretability? I think one promising such area is neurosymbolic AI. We're going to combine neural network components with simpler and more interpretable symbolic reasoning systems analogous to the decision tree I just described. These models, we hope, can perform just as well as large language models or neural network-based models, but have the interpretability of simpler models like decision trees. I'd like to briefly talk about one example of neurosymbolic AI in action. This is a new company being developed by my colleague and mentor at MIT, Omar Castilla-Reyes. And he's founded his company on the belief that healthcare is more effective when it is tailored to cultural context. He's targeting his solutions to Hispanic and Latino communities in the United States with the intention to expand to Latin America as time goes on. The problem Omar is tackling is that of choosing the right therapist for each patient. I'd like you to imagine for a moment that you're a patient with a mental disorder. You know that you need help, but you don't know how to go about finding a therapist. And there are numerous criteria that a potential therapist needs to fulfill for this to work out. The therapist needs to be somebody you can afford to see, or they need to be somebody that your insurance can cover. They need to live close enough to you or practice close enough to you that you can travel to see them, or they need to have a telemedicine option. You'd like them to have some degree of specialization or expertise in the type of mental disorder that you have or the type of therapy that you might need, something which you may not know or understand as the patient yet. And you hope that you hope to find somebody that is compatible with you at the level of personality or even cultural background. So this is an overwhelming problem for many patients, and it can lead to discouragement and people not ending up seeking care at all. I think this is a significant barrier to getting people in the mental health care system. This company is applying neurosymbolic AI to make a prediction for each patient about the optimal therapist for them. Not only will it provide a list of therapists that are considered optimal by a set of criteria based on a bunch of data provided by the patient, which could be anything from smartphone data to electronic health record data, and so on. It will also explain exactly why each therapist is being recommended. We talked a few minutes ago about the idea of treatment credibility and how if somebody believes in the therapy that they're about to receive and believes it will be effective, that therapy actually becomes more effective. This is not an isolated finding in body dysmorphic disorder. In fact, it's held true across many studies in many different disorders in mental health. If it holds true here, I think it's conceivable that matching a patient with the right therapist and having them understand how that decision was made could actually lead to better outcomes. To summarize, I think there are tremendous opportunities for innovation locally in Latin America and in other places for improving access to mental health treatments with AI. The estimated cost of mental disorders economically in South America alone was estimated at around $500 billion per year. And again, 75% of people who have a mental disorder don't have access to treatment. So from a business perspective, how often do you see a $500 billion US market with that is 75% unaddressed? Finally, we know that AI is biased, linguistically, culturally, and otherwise, and we know that access to AI is far from equal. Once again, I think local innovation is critical. I'd like to close by discussing briefly the risks of AI in healthcare. Healthcare is a domain where there are high risks. The consequence of providing false or misleading information to a patient could be potentially high. And I think this is an area that warrants a lot of careful scrutiny. We need to be very careful about how we implement these solutions. But I would argue that in a world where so many are suffering, and so few have access to the care that they need, the biggest risk of all is to do nothing and to leave things as they are. Thank you.